Since I started this podcast, I've had the privilege of interviewing some amazing people. But today is a really, really special event, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. My guest is John Volanthen. It's a name that might not immediately be that familiar to you. But if I turn around and mention instead the Tam Luang Thai cave rescue of the 13 people, 12 children and one coach from a football team who got stranded in a cave in 2018, then it might mean a little bit more. John, with his dive partner, Rick Stanton, were the two people who actually discovered the children were still alive and then were instrumental in the rescue of them from that cave. It's a story that went viral around the world, not least because of the incredible footage that John himself produced as they surfaced and found them, against all the odds when it seemed pretty hopeless and it was unlikely they were going to be even found, never mind found alive and subsequently rescued. And it's just an extraordinary story. It's one of the rescues that stands out as just uncanny, extraordinary, beyond belief, and literally a miracle event. And so to interview a man that was at the very center of that and who is incredibly modest about his achievements was just fabulous. And John is an incredibly modest man. He's a very, very accomplished, world-renowned cave diver. He's one of the world experts in that space. Not only does a lot of cave diving as a hobby, but cave exploration as well. And he'll talk more about that in the podcast. And he has led the way in many ways on lots and lots of things that have gone on. He carries with him a lot of records that he's actually achieved, and he's been honoured a number of times for a number of events, not least rescues and sadly sometimes recovery operations from cave exploration that's gone wrong with others. I really, as I say, hope you love the interview as much as I did. I think John brings to life so many really useful things that are relevant to leadership as well, about mindset, about self-awareness, about discipline, and thinking about the way that you actually you approach things that you actually do, and comfort zones we talked extensively about, and a whole range of other things. It's without doubt one of the great privileges I've had in doing this so far, and I fantastic to have had the opportunity to talk to and meet John and just enjoy. Hey John, thank you so much for joining me today. I do feel very, very privileged to have you on the podcast, and I'm really, really looking forward to the conversation.
I'm looking forward to it too. I always like to shoot the breeze. Sometimes it's really interesting to get other people's viewpoints on life and this sort of stuff. So hopefully it'll be an interesting chat.
Oh yeah, well, having watched a bit of some of the stuff about you, I have absolutely no doubt. I mean, you've had an absolutely amazing story so far. I mean, the Thai cave rescue is obviously probably the thing that is most out there, and is pretty unarguably, I think, one of the most amazing rescue operations that's ever been undertaken. I really want to come on and discuss that in more detail. But before we do that, it would be really helpful just to have a bit more background from you about you. And so we get to know you a little bit better, your kind of diving history, your broader career journey, as it were. So if you wouldn't mind, that would be a great start.
Sure. So my work life started in Great Ormond Street Hospital. My background is electronics, and I worked in biomedical engineering. And that was kind of probably quite formative for me, where I learned a little bit of discipline and about medical equipment, and ultimately I was able to apply that discipline to diving. The rest of my career is perhaps in more of an IT related areas, computer networking, bit of programming, and I ran a number of small companies over the years, but always focused in IT and always very small teams. I don't think I'd have worked very well in a corporate environment. But I've obviously had many hobbies as well, caving being one of those. I think it's important to point out it's a hobby. There's no money or career in cave diving. It's purely been an interest. I started in the Scouts, and I was a Brighton Scout, and Brighton tended to have, quite oddly, a fairly strong caving community. And they would take us to various places around the country, South Wales, Mendips in the southwest of England. And I sort of accidentally fell into that. And almost by accident in Somerset on one particular weekend, we were taken on a trip. And we eventually reached a particular point underground where we couldn't go any further because the way was blocked by a flooded passage. And I was quite impressionable at the time. And the trip leader, I can still remember his face and the explanation that he gave, but he was saying that it was almost impossible to continue. And perhaps I was keen, perhaps I was buoyed by the group that I was with. But I made a resolution to myself as a 14 or 15-year-old that I was going to come back to this place and I was going to pass that flooded tunnel. I was going to follow the rope that you could see under the water. It's like really muddy and horrible foamy water. But just the way he talked and the way he said all the difficulties and so on. And I just decided that was something I was going to do. So I was inspired to go back to that place that the leader had said that it was impossible to continue. I just had a sense I couldn't see a reason why not. And so it took me a number of years and moving around the country, and I eventually arrived back in Bristol where I learnt more caving and eventually cave diving. And I did find myself back there as an adult, and perhaps I was way out of my depth, but I was able to pass those sections of flooded cave and continue exploring right to the sort of known end of the cave. But my interest really fell into cave exploration, which is going to places that nobody's been to before. And I just enjoyed solving the problems. Quite often, caves don't end, especially underwater. What's happened is someone's reached a point where there's an obstacle they can't pass. And I was lucky in that it was perhaps a golden age where certain types of equipment had just become available. And there were caves that were ready to be explored because others had turned around. And so I was involved in a lot of cave exploration, mapping those tunnels, solving the problems and working out the logistics of how to go further. But our hallmark, I suppose my hallmark, really was adapting, where quite often in diving, you pick a particular either piece of technology or style of diving, and you always dive in a certain way. You always dive with a certain configuration, where what I've always tried to do is to have a toolbox of equipment that gets assembled specifically tailored to solve the problem that the cave presents. And that flexibility, it looks like quite often we dive with all sorts of elastic bands and odd things that are cobbled together. But that's a very deliberate thing because it's completely flexible. If the problem is that the last explorer couldn't get out the water, then we'll configure our equipment so we can take it off piecemeal. If the problem is depth, then we'll look at how we're trying to solve that problem. It's just dealing. My hallmark has been adapting and dealing with the problems that each cave presented, and that's probably what sets me apart as a cave explorer. And so that's really in my caving journey where I've come from. And in more modern times, it's a lot easier to buy the equipment. But 10, 20 years ago, we had to make all that equipment, and we would stay ahead of the curve, as it were, by trying to understand what was needed and then manufacture that equipment. Sometimes it was a field of dreams sort of idea where you think, hey, I can make this. You create it, test it, and then it becomes obvious where it needs applying. Other times you look at a cave and you think, I know what I need to do to get to the end of that cave. And then you create the equipment to do it. But then slowly you build a body of experience, a body of procedures and so on. And that's kind of where we got to. The rescue side of things for me was an accident. Cave rescue in the UK is completely voluntary. Nobody gets paid for it. Nobody will ever get paid for it. But the experts are the people that go caving and cave diving all the time. And so what I found was that when there was a problem, quite often it wasn't a case of me stepping forwards, not initially at least. It was more a case of everybody else stepping backwards and me realizing, well, actually, I'm the person that's more appropriate to solve this problem. Or I was one of a small group that was appropriate to solve a problem. And I'm a great believer in community. I'm a great believer in offering service and skills where it's appropriate. And it just seemed natural to me to offer to help.
Yeah, it's a fantastic thing you do, that's for sure, and bringing that expertise to bear in such a positive way is just extraordinary. I mean, you've touched on a number of things there that really interest me. I mean, as a scuba diver myself, I've done a fair bit of diving, but nothing on your scale. But I've done a reasonable amount of wrecks, and I've done some deep air tech diving and things. But I've never done under ice. I've never done caves. I'd just be really interested in a bit more of your perspective on how you go about doing that and how you sort of plan and execute cave diving and what it's like for people who've never done it, because it is, for a lot of recreational divers, I think it's one of these things where people say, whoa, don't go anywhere near that, most dangerous sport in the world and all those sorts of things which get bandied around about it. But you obviously love it, and just your perspective would be really interesting.
I always say that cave diving is not an adrenaline sport, and I think that's really important. You didn't use that word; you used the word dangerous sport. I would certainly say it's unforgiving. That there are lots of different types of cave diving. So if you go to somewhere like Florida or Mexico, people operate in teams. They often operate in clear water. They look after each other, and that's fine. That's a good and productive type of cave diving. British cave diving tends to be quite different in that you often have to do a significant amount of dry caving and carry equipment to get to the water. And the passages are often very constricted, and there's often very poor visibility. Sometimes it can be so turbid you literally can't see the walls of the cave, or you can't see your hand in front of your face. You've got to literally bounce off the walls to try and make sure that you're going in the right direction. And so British cave diving typically promotes a solo mindset. You're really trying to take with you, underground or underwater certainly, everything that you need to survive. There's no point in bolting for the exit, because that will probably make a bad situation worse. It's about taking with you everything that you need, moving forwards very calmly and understanding your situation. And as soon as a problem arises, solving that problem or turning around and heading back to the surface. If you move forwards, then you can potentially go forwards into more and more difficulties. I think we often have this idea of people taking their equipment off, pushing it in front of them, and perhaps putting it back on again, and just doing that randomly. That sort of stuff doesn't happen. It happens after a lot of thought, a lot of practice, and possibly even rehearsals. But it's not like skydiving. I always suggest that skydiving, once you jump out of the aircraft, I've never done it, but you can't go back. You can't say, whoops, I left my parachute there, or I'd much rather I was back in the aircraft. Once you go, you're committed. Cave diving isn't really like that. What you can do is you can move forwards literally a couple of inches, and you can say, hey, how does this feel now? Have I secured my exit? And if you feel comfortable, you can move forwards a couple more inches, or half a meter or whatever. But if you're uncomfortable, you're not necessarily committed. I've always tried and avoid commitment in cave diving, so that you're always leaving yourself a way out, or making sure that you guard your exit. It's a lot less like an adrenaline sport than people would want to believe, but it does perhaps combine many of the things that lots of people sort of find are fearful, such as being in small spaces, being in dark spaces, and possibly being underwater. But if you set aside those really irrational fears, then you just become comfortable in the environment that you're in, and deal with the problems as they arise.
I love the way you make it sound so straightforward. When you're in a dark space that's really constricting and you're underwater, then that definitely sounds like the adrenaline's going to flow for an awful lot of people. I mean, you in, I guess, personal mentality, you are naturally have to be a very calm person who's good at stress management for yourself. Because without doing that's you're going to get yourself into a world of difficulty, aren't you? I guess. And is that just a discipline thing? Is that just training? And how have you got yourself into that position?
I think different people approach stress management in different ways. I found that becoming more self-aware has been really important to me. So I can generally look at myself and I assess my own performance, my own state of mind, and sometimes state of body, because sometimes that fear manifests itself. You can feel it sort of rising in your stomach, and you can either go with it and start to make poor judgments, or you can understand yourself, understand what's going on, and try and deal with that. And quite often those problems or that fear arises when problems start and things go wrong. So it's a case for me of being self-aware, of trying to understand, hang on, I can feel that there's something here that I'm not happy with. And I almost visually push that fear down, back into my stomach. I also quite like a bit of disassociation. This will make you laugh, but I don't know if you've ever watched Star Trek.
Yeah.
The original old Star Trek, you used to have Captain Kirk, who was the kind of the flamboyant one, and you used to have Dr. Spock, who was the unemotional Vulcan, as it were.
Yeah.
And I sometimes imagine that I've got Dr. Spock sat on my shoulder, and I try and be that Dr. Spock, looking at the situation in an unemotional way. It's just a way of taking yourself slightly out of it, and then taking the emotion out of it, and then trying to make good decisions.
Yeah, that's a great skill to have if you can do it, that's for sure, because I think that for a lot of people I talk quite a lot when I do leadership training for people about comfort zones, stretch zones and panic zones. And clearly, the benefit is staying away from the panic zone by and large, and but getting into the stretch zone. So you actually make the comfort zone bigger and make the panic zone by definition smaller. But for a lot of people, obviously, that is a really challenging kind of area. I mean, I'm guessing, I spent years flying airplanes in the Air Force. You don't get to do that kind of job for years without having a few pretty major moments. You must have had exactly the same with caving as well. I think in both dry caving and cave diving. Have you had any sort of really tense times?
Yes, I think dry caving less so, because you've usually got time because you can breathe. But when you're underwater, in one shape or form, there's always a clock running, whether that's based on the amount of air you've got or if there are decompression issues. But what I tend to do, another technique that I use that I think works really well, is I break my situation down into 3 time frames. And I think about, firstly, the next 3 seconds. And if I'm underwater, almost inevitably, that's where's my next breath coming from. So I might check my spare regulator, or just make sure that it's sat where it's supposed to be, or that kind of thing. But really, I deal with that 3 seconds. And then if that seems to be comfortable, I'll think about the next 3 minutes, which is usually my immediate surroundings. I might check the pressure gauges on cylinders. I might think about where I'm trying to move in the cave passage, but nothing too far ahead. What am I trying to accomplish in my immediate surroundings? What do I need to deal with to survive the next 3 minutes? And if that seems to be okay, I'll think about the next 3 hours, which is often the bigger, scarier stuff, such as how am I going to get out of a cave? And so sometimes if you're in a difficult situation, you can't imagine how you're going to deal with all of the problems to get you out of the cave. It almost sometimes seems overwhelming. And that's the moment to sort of drop back and reduce your attention to 3 minutes. Or if that's overwhelming, drop back and literally, let's take a couple of breaths here, and then let's calm down a bit and try and move forwards. So I think it's interesting you talk about stretch zones and comfort zones. I have a phrase that I quite like, which is comfortably uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that is what I think you're calling the stretch zone, which is where you're outside your comfort zone. But in cave diving, I have a very clear awareness of what I call danger. So there's a difference between being uncomfortable and in danger. And it's okay to be uncomfortable. That's not unusual. That's not necessarily a problem. Sometimes it's beneficial because, as you suggest, you grow your comfort zone. In order to do that safely, you have to have a very clear vision, I think, of where danger is. And I continually calculate where I feel that line is. And usually that's the number of mistakes I can make, the number of things that can go wrong before a situation is irrecoverable. And I can think of a number of rescues where I'm aware that because of a series of events, or really just the situation that you're in, suddenly you reached a point where actually now is the moment. I'm on that line. I cannot afford to make any mistakes, or I won't be able to recover from this situation. And it's just for me being aware of that and understanding this is the moment. And I've just got to make sure that I don't make any mistakes. I would say your buffer has run out at that point.
Yeah, no, that makes absolute sense. That's really great advice as well. I mean, I had a horrible moment when I was diving good many years ago, and I was doing my tech diving training actually, and we were deep. We were at 60 meters on air, and we've been doing lots of drills and skills drills with the instructor. There were two students, of which I was one, and an instructor, and I actually ended up running out of air in my back gas, which was just, I was obviously narcosis. I wasn't really aware that I was in the situation I was until I was suddenly in a really nasty situation. And of course, as sod's law would have it, we literally just turned into we were one behind the other, swimming back towards the reef in the Red Sea. And I was at the back, so I was in the worst possible position to do that. And it was a redundant sport. We were taught to be self-reliant and redundant on the way we were doing it. And I am convinced that it was actually a lot of, not least my military training, that caused me to just do kind of what you just described and think through the problem, which was obviously dire. At that, I had two cylinders of rich mixed gas, but they were toxic at that depth. So, I had to make some very quick decisions about what I was going to do and how I was going to resolve the situation. And obviously I had air in my lungs and so on as well still. And obviously I'm still talking to you, so I got away with it. But it was a major moment. And I learned a lot from it, both in diving terms, but also about sort of, self-reliance and thinking through problems in exactly that way, because I'm sure that it really, really helped. And I think it's the sort of thing for a lot of people that you never really know how you're going to react until you're in one of those kind of difficult situations. But hopefully at the time, then whatever you've done in preparation beforehand will stand you in good stead.
I think you're right. I've also seen with cave divers quite a lot. You get people they're absolutely amazing cave divers and nothing ever goes wrong. And that's not really what you want. You asked earlier if I'd had things going wrong. And the answer is yes, all the time. But that's okay, because you kind of normalize those problems. I've seen in the past people who they're so good they don't have any problems. And then when something does go wrong, they're not equipped to deal with that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I do think normalizing incidents and difficulties is actually a good thing. I don't think we should shy away from them. What you ideally want in a cave diving career, I would suggest, is incidents in an ascending level of difficulty that allow you to learn to cope with them and study your own reactions. But of course, in order to learn from that, you have to be self-reflective. If you're not prepared to look at yourself and your own reactions and so on, then you're not actually going to learn anything.
Yeah, that's great. That's really, really interesting. I think then it's a neat segue into what I was going to come on to. And this podcast is obviously all about leadership and looking specifically at leadership traits, both for yourself, but just as importantly, I mean, a lot of the time when you've been, doing your normal cave diving, but also doing some of the rescues, and it's very apparent from watching some of the films and so on about your rescue in Thailand, the working with others and leadership skills of others. What do you like and what do you don't like in that sense? What do you really look for in leadership traits?
I think perhaps cave divers, or certainly British cave divers, are, I don't want to say a rare breed, so I'm going to say an odd breed. And sort of going back to what I talked about before, British cave divers are typically self-sufficient. And that is I think that's almost a requirement. And so in terms of teams for rescues, what we tend to look for is people that are self-sufficient but are disciplined enough to work as a team. And that's really key. We quite often have a concept of serial or parallel teams. And this works a bit like electronics. If you have a team that's in series, if one person has a problem, then the chain is broken and everybody has to turn around and head back to the surface. And that typically is the way that most technical divers work if you've got a buddy or if you've got a group. And that's okay. But it's not particularly great for either a rescue or for an exploration that you may have had one chance in a year to actually explore a particular piece of cave. So our preference is always for what I call parallel teams, which is where if one person has to turn around, the other person or people still have the ability to continue on and hopefully achieve the mission, or they're able to sort of contribute in some meaningful way, even if you can't achieve the whole goal. So we are slightly different in that I think there are a lot of individuals. I do think in a workplace environment, probably need a little bit more integration. But I think that, again, the traits that I mentioned previously about self-awareness are really important. I don't think you can expect to lead a team unless you know yourself. I don't think you have the. I don't think you have that ability. It might work fine while everything's going well, but in a crisis moment, if you don't know yourself, if you can't be aware of your own strengths, weaknesses, and how you respond, it's very hard to expect people to, for want of a better word, follow you. I also think that ego is a very important thing, or more specifically, lack of it. In my life, I always say I've never been very good, or I would never have been very good had I had a corporate career. I don't think I would have worked very well. I tend to like to look at the problem, and whatever the goal is, I want to work towards the goal. What's important to me is that the goal is achieved and that the team gets the credit. I don't want personal credit, and I also don't want to be performing what I call office politics. I think I've always felt that if you work towards the goal, if everybody tries to deliver that goal, whatever that might be, or achieve whatever you're aiming for, then usually people know. I think those that know usually find out, and sometimes that's just your teammates. So I don't think that ego is particularly helpful in a team. So I think there's probably a bunch of different criteria there. But in terms of teams that I've worked with, they're usually teams that work in high pressure situations. Those seem to me to be quite useful traits. The other thing I would add, that is a slightly odd thing to add, but I've appreciated it in the past. I think diversity in a team is quite important. Now, we've not always had that choice because we are, as cavers, a very small group. But if you're trying to problem solve different viewpoints, different experiences, people come up with all sorts of different blue sky ideas, where if you've all come from the same stable, shall we say, your sort of field or seed of ideas is often much smaller.
Yeah, some really powerful points you're making. I think that's fantastic. The self-awareness one, particularly, and ego, and as you say at the end there, I think the multiplicity of ideas where you can get that is really, really powerful, inevitably, and that must be so important for some of the stuff you've done, particularly on the rescue front, where you need people to think out of the box and come up with alternative strategies and bring all the experience they've got from different environments and different experiences to bear, for sure. I can completely see that. Yes, it's certainly interesting because cave rescues often happen as well at night in the dark, when you're tired, when you don't want them, and if you're not, again, aware of yourself and your strengths and weaknesses and prepared to work as a team, it just doesn't work. I have seen before a number of people who get as far as the water because they think they're on the case and they think they want to be a part of this because they think it sounds cool. They get to the water and they won't dive. And they've wasted all that time, all that resources. It's the right decision for them, but they've wasted a lot of time. So the self-awareness, certainly for cave diving, I think is quite important. Yeah, well, no, totally agree with that. Just before we move on to something else, role models. Can we just touch on role models? I mean, who over the years, you've been doing this a long time. You're obviously a bit of a pioneer, as you said, in terms of exploration, and you've set records and all sorts of things doing what you've done with caving. But who do you look up to? Who's really inspired you in that mode over the years?
I'm probably not the best person to ask about role models. I tend to take people as I find them, and I don't really have many people that I would say I look up to. But the one person who, over the years, has impressed me immensely by both his achievements and also his demeanour is Tim Peake.
Yeah.
I think he's an absolutely stellar and sound person. If ever there was somebody who's the real deal, it's him. And pretty much, I don't know him well. I've met him, and he was again all of the things that I've talked about. But I can't imagine anybody else who embodies those sorts of qualities more than Tim Peake.
No, that makes total sense. So Tim and I share a godson. We have a mutual friend, and we're both godfathers to his oldest son. So yeah, he's a fantastic guy, and I think actually a bit like Chris Hadfield's another one actually in astronaut terms, the Canadian who I think, having come back from space, has done incredible things in terms of inspiring people to understand more about it and look at that whole science and technology world and basically get more interested in it because they make it interesting. They bring it to life in a way that is really relatable and very very, very helpful. And Tim is fabulous at doing that. That's a great example. And actually, again, that's a super segue into the next question because I know you've been both yourself in the Scouts, etc. But you work with the Cubs these days. I mean, as an ex-Scout myself, I mean, I can only imagine. You say you don't have that many role models. I tell you for free, you are a serious role model. I mean, if you look at what you've done and what you achieve and your whole approach and the kind of altruistic nature and the very, very high risk enterprises you've gone into to save other people's lives at massive personal risk. I mean, that is an incredible thing to do. And I can only imagine that the Cub Scouts that you work with in Bristol are intensely proud of having you there. I'd just be interested in your take though about youth organisations, and because I know you've done a lot of this in terms of development from stuff you did yourself, and how you see that now. Are we doing enough? Are we should we be doing more? Where's your views on that?
So I have three roles in the Scouts. The Cub Scouts are age 8 to roughly 10 and a half. I also take all sorts of age groups caving because, again, it's important to me to give back. People gave to me when I was a youth, and I really like that. I also do training for older groups for the 10 Tours, which is a hike that happens on Dartmoor in May every year. And the caving and the 10 Tours especially is about again, as you've talked about, getting youth out of their comfort zone and having them realise for the first time when it going gets tough that they can still look after themselves. I'm a great believer in the Scouts. I've come across St John's recently. They do a lot of youth stuff, and again, it's really good. But the Scouts have impressed me mostly because any organisation, whether it's a business or a youth organisation, that can stay relevant and stay current over such a long period of time has got to be doing something right. The Scouts change fairly constantly, I would say. It was a good number of years ago that they made the revolutionary decision. They didn't say, okay, we're going to accept girls. They said, we're going to accept everybody. We're not going to, I suppose now the word discriminate is almost the wrong word to use, but they said, we'll accept everybody. And again, when they did that, which was decades ago, it was a really forward-thinking thing to do. And they seem to have managed to have kept relevant. I think there is a difficulty these days with adventure sports and youth groups where in lots of ways there's a very large aversion to risk. And I understand that. There have been some, in the outdoor world, there have been some clear disasters that have occurred over the years. that have been hallmarks and promoted a lot of change in the outdoor world. It is a difficult situation, especially for a volunteer organisation where you're trying to regulate people. I've made a point over the years of going and obtaining national qualifications for caving, for mountain leader, for climbing, and those sorts of things. I felt, for me, it was important, even as a volunteer, to make sure that skills and policies and procedures were as top notch as they could be. That was the only way I could justify to myself that what I was doing was correct. And most of that was really just validation. But having someone externally validate you and say, this is okay, this is good, this is the gold standard, seemed to me to be the right thing to do. Paid organisations such as PGL and so on can do that, and do that. It's harder for the Scouts, I think, and other youth organisations, but it is absolutely critical. Clearly, safety is critical. That there's been an inquest that's been concluded recently relating to an incident that occurred a number of years ago in the Scouts, and again, it's heartbreaking. I don't know what the answer is. It is a very, very difficult answer, or very difficult question with no answer, because if it's your child, it's clearly a problem. But if you never teach a child to cross a road because you're too frightened they might get run over, then when they reach 18, they just walk out on a motorway because they don't know any better. I don't know how you create that tension.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's analogous really to what you were talking about earlier on with cave diving, where actually what you really want is you want a progression in terms of things going wrong in small steps. So you actually, you build up a tolerance for it. I totally agree. I mean, it's the risk aversion point was one I would have come back to if you hadn't brought it out yourself. I mean, I think it is obviously an area of challenge for anything in the outdoor arena, and particularly, I used to be a school governor for a number of years, and you could see this writ large with people's reluctance to do stuff starting to come to the fore because they were, worried about, litigation ultimately, and being taken to court or being held to account for something that had gone wrong. I think obviously personal preparation is also really key, isn't it? I mean, in terms of genuinely having the skills yourself, having the qualifications, and having the kind of being the real deal, to use your expression, when you're going to go and do something, because some of the time I think people do step into a world where they say, right, we'll go and do that, and they're just not equipped to do it. They don't really have the right skills to get them over the start line in terms of doing it properly, and particularly if you're doing it with kids where they're totally reliant on you, then that's a much riskier thing to do.
What we try and do, especially with the caving, is to create a situation where there is apparent risk. So me going into a cave that I've been into dozens of times before, possibly hundreds of times before, that I know intimately, I can send a group off down a particular place to explore. They might have been wound round underground for an hour or so. They might feel really exposed and a really long way from the entrance, but that might not necessarily be the case. So you can create apparent risk that a group can learn from, bond from, and enjoy, as it were, whilst you're managing the real risk. The danger is when those two are reversed, where something might appear safe, but it's actually incredibly dangerous.
Yeah, no, that makes great sense. Great example. We couldn't have an interview without me talking about 2018 and the whole Thai rescue. I mean, I've watched The Rescue, the documentary, which I have to say just blew me away. And for anyone listening to this, if you haven't watched it, watch it. It is just an extraordinary story. But I'm really interested in your take on the whole thing, really, from beginning to end, and just tell the story, if you wouldn't mind, in your words, because it was, as I said at the beginning, one of the most outstanding rescues. I think the only other one that has really caught my eye in a similar way was the Chilean miners, which I think it was similar. Everyone thought these guys are all going to die. There was almost no chance they were going to be rescued, and then lo and behold, they managed to get to them and they got them all out. And the sort of euphoria when that happened was extraordinary. And it was very similar with what happened with with the wild boars in Thailand. And I'd love to hear it from your lips.
I think we could probably do an entire podcast on that particular subject. The kids went into a cave for a laugh. That they were unlucky in that the cave has two water levels: a monsoon level where it floods, and normally throughout the year it's completely dry. They've been there many times before. On this occasion, they went into the cave, and unfortunately, rain that had fallen previously sort of flowed through a particular inlet and blocked their way. And then over the following days, the water level just continued to rise. Caving, as I've sort of mentioned, cave exploration especially is a very small community. And so an expat Brit was called to help because he knew the cave, and he realised immediately that cave divers were needed. And so we were aware quite early on of the situation and what the problems were. And it's always a very difficult decision as to whether you put yourself forwards and then how that actually happens. And I felt very strongly this time. I do believe in intuition. I think we all have intuition. It's a question of whether we are in tune enough to listen to it. And it just seemed to me at that moment that we needed to be there. I can't say it any more or less direct than that. At that moment, we knew a lot of people throughout the world who were good cave divers, but I felt that there was something specific about that situation that we needed to be there, particularly that there was a series of flooded sections of cave, and that what I call amphibious caving or amphibious cave diving is quite an unusual set of skills. And so we put ourselves forward and were eventually brought out. We had actually expected that we would be called. Usually, this often happens with national pride, where the locals want to have a go first because that's how it works. And then you get a call a long time after there's likely to be any survivors. But the Thais were incredibly brave. They asked for outside help very early, and so we were brought in. To cut a very long story short, we were brought in as they brought in a whole lot of other groups from a whole lot of different countries, and so rather unexpectedly, we had to establish ourselves as experts, and we did that partly through action, by actually doing stuff, and by actually going into the cave, and also by trying to win over various people, just in terms of sort of team building and so on. And over the following days, we achieved that, and then we continued on laying a guideline upstream. A lot of things happened, a lot of difficulties, but eventually we reached an airspace, and it was clear that this one was different. Underground, things smell kind of sterile. They don't really have a smell except for mud. And this particular chamber smelled terrible. And Rick, my dive partner, and I were convinced almost from the outset that the boys would be dead and that we would be looking for bodies. And partly our mentality was that we were looking for certainty. So in any sort of rescue, you want either proof of life, that's the best case, or proof of death. Well, that means you can go home. So when we smelt the air in this chamber, we had a discussion saying, look, at least some of them are dead here. There's something quite unpleasant here. But as these lights started appearing and boys started walking down the mud bank, Rick counted and we realised that they were all alive. And it was quite a strange moment for me, because we were quite a long way from safety at that point, and I was virtually at my limit for my own coping mechanism at the time. And suddenly everything had changed, and now that almost didn't matter anymore. We were responsible for these children, and so what sort of followed beyond that was a series of ideas from various people as to how to rescue them. It was quite amusing, where everybody had an idea as to how to rescue the children, but none really understood the conditions that were truly to be found in the cave. We knew the only practical way out would be to dive them out. Unlike the Chilean miners, the cave wasn't surveyed very accurately. So there was no way to drill to any point. It was literally like trying to find a needle in a haystack. And on top of that, the mountain was well over 800 meters above. So it just wasn't possible to drill. And even if you could, you'd never have hit the cave tunnel in the right place. So the only way the boys were coming out was the way that they'd gone in. And it was Rick originally sort of suggesting that what we need to do is bring them out as if they're packages. And that sort of idea progressed, and we talked about sedation. And I had in mind, really, some way of making sure the boys were compliant rather than actually fully sedating them. But Rick eventually contacted an Australian cave explorer, Dr. Richard Harris. And he did agree to come to Thailand, not to sedate the boys initially, but to sort of see the situation for himself. I don't think in his heart he believed that he would actually take the risk. But Rick sent him into the cave with his dive partner and basically said, look, you're going to see these children happy and smiley. They're sat in a cave. Unless you sedate them, they're all going to die.
No pressure.
No pressure. And he came out and he agreed to do it. But by which time we had really sort of fine-tuned that sort of procedure that we would use. And we'd also rehearsed as well. We rehearsed in a swimming pool. And that was something that wasn't particularly published at the time as well. And then eventually we brought out 4 children per day, and they were essentially completely unconscious. And they had to be resedated on the way out because of the drugs that we used. And it was a little bit hit and miss with the dosage, but some of the boys slept for quite a long time after they were outside the cave. But as it turned out, none of them had any memory of the journey at the end. The coach was brought out in the same way, exactly the same problem. And that, as they say, was that really. But yes, I think that there was quite a lot of pressure all round.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound simple, but I marvel at what you achieved. You made the impossible possible, I think, really, because it just looks an extraordinary challenge. I mean, there's a couple of things immediately that spring to mind. I mean, one, when you, I think watching the documentary about it, you were pushing your own air reserves and so on as before you discovered the boys. And you just had that kind of gut feeling that we need to push, I think, with your words that are on the documentary. And clearly that was a great decision because you then did discover them. What was your feeling and that of Rick when you literally saw they were all there? I mean, that must have just been the most incredible moment, wasn't it?
I simply couldn't believe it. And there is a line on the video that we took of the boys. The camera we had accidentally, the camera was to film a particular piece of the cave that the Thai Navy SEALs wanted to know. They wanted to know if they reached this particular cave, what they would see. And so I've talked about proof of life, and the obvious thing of proof of life was to take a video of all the faces of the boys. And there's audio on that. We didn't know it had audio, but I'm saying believe on the audio. And it was me trying to convince myself that the situation was real. It had just changed so abruptly. And that, yes, we were beyond our air reserves. Rick and I have worked together or dived together a great many years. And sometimes there's a moment where you think everything's going well. Now's the moment to bend the rules, as it were. And it just felt to me that was the right time, the right moment and the right thing to do. And yeah, there's a little bit of intuition there.
Yeah, I think incredible. I mean, I can only imagine what that must have felt like, and actually for the boys as well, of course. And I guess the challenge you immediately faced was they probably thought, "Great, this is it. We're now going to be rescued." And then it's obviously, no, all we've done is discover you. We've now got to turn around and find a way to get you out, which must have been quite difficult to keep them motivated. And it was interesting the way the Thais obviously sent some SEALs in to essentially be with them, which I think must have been quite helpful. And you went back, I know yourself, to take them food and things. one of the other things I hadn't appreciated until I did a bit more looking at the documentary and so on, not least in prep for talking to you today, was you in one of your early dives, might even have been your first one, was it, where you discovered the pump workers that were nobody even knew were missing, and had actually dived them out. How much did that influence your decisions around what you could or couldn't do with the boys? Because clearly that was a pretty difficult experience getting those guys out.
We've dived people out of various places previously. The pump workers were certainly interesting in that there was a lot of chaos through very short sections of passage, and I think that probably hardened the resolve that we didn't feel that we could bring the boys out without sedating them in some way, because they would unquestionably panic at some point. As it was, the boys were fairly well restrained to make sure that if they woke up, they didn't try and pull their mask off or something like that. But had they been conscious, we just simply couldn't have done that.
Yeah, wow. And just maneuvering, because I guess if you're maneuvering a package around through the cave and moving cylinders and all those sorts of things, then you care less about obviously what you bang it into and that sort of thing than if you've got you're carrying a human out with all the reliance that's there. It must have been just incredibly challenging, as you described, with very, very turbid water, almost no visibility, phenomenally difficult to actually just navigate your way back. And I guess that's entirely dependent on staying on the line and getting back to the entrance in good order over what was a long period of time. And we were talking just before we came on air. I mean, this was like a 3 hour plus dive, right?
It was certainly a long time, and I think you're right in that the difference with the boys was that the mask was a full face mask they had to breathe from, and the seal on that mask was crucial. It had to be perfect, and we couldn't afford to knock their face at any moment, because any water ingress into the mask would unquestionably have resulted in the boy drowning. We had them on oxygen rather than air, which was intended to give us hopefully some minutes of spare time in case they did drown, to actually bring them to an airspace and revive them. But as it turned out, all of us were careful enough, and that was never an issue. But certainly a lot more care was perhaps required than you might normally find if you're just moving cylinders or other sort of bulky equipment around. Yeah,
for sure. Well, I mean, one of the things that hugely amused me on the documentary is where you said, I think it's you that said it, that they flew us out business class. A, I should hope so, and B, I hope they flew you back first class, because it was just the most amazing thing.
So it's funny you mentioned that. We flew back business class, which again was very kind and appreciated, and was very nice. But Chris Jewell did actually ask the stewardess, how many boys do we need to save to get first class?
Fantastic. That's just brilliant. You should frankly be traveling business class for the rest of your days on the back of that. I think it's just the most extraordinary story, and well done to you, and entirely justifiably rewarded with the George Medal for it, which I think is the very least that we should have given you for that. Quite incredible. As you say, we could probably spend an entire podcast talking about it. I just want to cover a couple of other things. Highs and lows. I tend to talk about highs and lows on all of these podcasts with my guests. And what would you have done when you look back across the whole of your sort of life to date? Things you would have done differently. What would you when you look back on it? What would you do differently, and why?
I'm a great believer that we are the sum of our experiences. I think that includes the positive and the negative. The important thing to me is to learn from both, exactly the same. And so clearly, as I look back at many things, there are places that I could have done better, or I could have done things to achieve more. But I mean, I am my own worst critic, or my own harshest critic, I should probably say. So what I'm about to say, it isn't intended to be arrogant, but I wouldn't change anything, because I think I do believe in the butterfly effect. I do believe that if you change one small thing, that it kind of affects everything else. And I'm quite comfortable where I've ended up, I suppose. Life is a journey. Life is a journey of growth, and that continues for me, and I continue to look at and self-reflect and also criticize myself and my performance. But I don't think it's helpful to look back and say, I wish I'd done this differently, or I wish I'd done that differently. That doesn't mean by any stretch of the imagination things couldn't have been done better. But I do think with the sum of our experiences, I do quite like looking back occasionally at what I think are the turning points in my life. And I've got a son of 17, and I've talked to him a little bit about this because it's quite interesting to do it at any age. And if you really think back, I've always found that the turning points are often much less significant than you realize, where some small act of kindness that you didn't even realize at the time, or some small decision that seems irrelevant, sets you on a path for much bigger things. And so I don't think there's anything I'd change, but that's not necessarily or not at all an admission that nothing could have gone better.
No, that's really helpful. It's very useful advice as well. I totally share your view about not looking back too much and wishing you'd done different things. I tend to talk about forks in the road, and when you go up one fork, and there's no point in looking back and regretting you didn't go up the other one. I mean, it's just life's too short. You've got to move on and do something else. So no, that makes great sense. In terms of high points, though, you've had, by any measure, you've done a hell of a lot with your life in terms of the stuff that's already behind you. But what would you consider your kind of most important achievement so far?
It's an interesting terminology, and I don't mean to argue with your terminology. I don't think anything's that important. I think important is relative. If you ask some of the people that have been brought out of a cave, they probably think that was important. But I would certainly look at a high point, and I would look at what's important to me. And I have a slightly odd one in that I do a lot of long distance running, and I completed a race a number of years ago now called the Spartathlon, which is a running race in Greece, and it recreates the journey that Phidippides took. He left Athens at sunup, and he arrived in Sparta to ask for the Spartans to send help, and he arrived a day later at sundown. And the race recreates that deed, as they call it, and it's 153 miles in September in Greece. And in ultra running, it's sort of quite a touchstone. And I thought I would give it a go. I didn't expect in any way to be able to complete it. And I gave it a go, and I got to 90 miles. And I was disappointed. I wasn't really surprised, but I came away with this idea that I thought, I'm punching above my weight, but I can see that this is possible. And I spent a year, perhaps not dedicating my life to it, but certainly I was firmly focused on training, on learning, on improving. And I went back the next year and finished the race. And to me, that was one of my highlights. Probably after starting at 7 a.m., I think at probably 3 or 4 in the morning, I was sat on a curbside somewhere in the middle of rural Greece. I'd just been up a mountain that was about the size of Ben Nevis, and I didn't think I could go on. And something changed in me at that point, where I got up and I started continuing to walk, and then slowly walking became jogging, and jogging became running, and I finished in about 34 and a half hours, which was just in front of sort of the time limit, as it were. And I've always felt quietly that was probably one of the things I was most proud of, because it was one of the things that I tried that was probably completely beyond my capabilities, and I properly rose to that challenge. Most people haven't heard of the race, but for me, that was quite a key moment.
That is an extraordinary achievement. I mean, I've done a couple of London marathons, and I didn't think that was bad, but wow. I mean, that's, and in that time to cover that distance, yeah, I'm not surprised you're proud of that. That's wow, just amazing. Sadly, for every high, there's a low point, John. What's the low point for you?
The low point is a mixed one, and it's probably also on a par with my high point. So I would, again, being brutally honest, I would say I was divorced perhaps 12 years ago now, and I found that incredibly difficult. That was definitely a low point for me. I had to almost reevaluate myself completely. I wouldn't say reinvent myself because my values were constant, but it required a lot of self-reflection and a lot of time looking inwards. But having come through it, I would say I've always said that was both the worst and the best thing that ever happened to me, because again, it set me on a path of self-discovery that has continued. Perhaps in lots of ways, I've become too comfortable. And you've talked a lot about comfort zones and stretching comfort zones, and that's something that I'm now very much aware of, and really is sort of central to my life, I would say.
Yeah, I can equate to that in terms of the divorce thing, having been through that myself. It's definitely a very difficult time, no matter how well kind of prepared you are for it, I suppose. But it's great points all along. Work-life balance is another interesting area I tend to touch on. I mean, and I know some people don't like the term these days, and they talk about just life balance and other things. But obviously we've covered a lot of stuff that is effectively your hobby. I mean, you do caving and cave diving and climbing and so on as that. But you also, clearly have a regular job and so on as well. How do you balance the two? What are your top tips for anyone listening to this in terms of making sure they get the most out of their life?
So it's interesting you talk about life balance rather than work-life balance. And I suppose my approach is, I hadn't thought of it in those terms before, but it probably is a life balance. What I found is that the moments when you feel that you're least able to take time are probably the moments when you most need to take time. And so, again, there's a little bit of trying to listen to what's happening inside me, and when I think, oh, I can't do that, or I haven't got time for that, or I need to give up so and so, I sort of try and pause and I think, hang on, there's a thing here. What I actually need to do is to pause, evaluate what I'm doing, and probably take a little bit of time out. And my time out tends to be exercise. I tend to find that I relax quite a lot with exercise, and so that for me is a really good way of stress relief.
Yeah, exercise for you is with some of the stuff you've described, I think will be some people's nightmare, to be honest, with the kind of distances you cover and the things you do. But no, great, really helpful. Just getting towards the end, really, on some of this. But you've written a book, you've had films, various actually, made about you in terms of the Thai rescue. But watching you in interviews, talking to you now on the interview, you do strike me as you're an incredibly modest guy, and you're something of a reluctant hero, I think, in this. But hero you most definitely are for some of the stuff you've done. How have you found that, dealing with the fame and recognition piece that came particularly from 2018?
I would argue that anyone who had a set of skills and could help, whether it's first aid at the roadside or whatever it is, we would all help if we could. I don't think I'm particularly different in that respect. It just turned out in 2018 that I had a particularly odd set of skills, and prior and since, sometimes it's what's needed, and I think all of us would step up if we could. I've sort of tried to ignore most of the stuff that goes around. I mentioned ego earlier on. Ego is very dangerous for a cave diver, and I think it's not a great quality in life. I think it's far better to do your thing and then get back to, call it grassroots level, call it real life. There's still mortgages to pay, there's still bills to pay. We're all very similar, really, and I just sort of don't see it, really. It just strikes me as a little bit odd. But I do see some responsibility, where I felt for a long time that a lot of the lessons I've learned underground and underwater were very applicable to the workplace. And I've spent a lot of time actually applying those to the places that I've worked, helping people in sort of high risk and certainly high pressure environments. And so when the rescue occurred, I hadn't initially intended to write a book, but it just seemed to me to be a good framework to hang those lessons off. It's a good story, and it's also a good way of of trying to get that information out there again and trying to present a different viewpoint. There's many approaches, many viewpoints, and so perhaps that's the only thing you could say where I've sort of tried to step up to the plate, as it were. But I don't like the word hero. I don't think it's particularly useful.
It doesn't surprise me in the slightest to hear you say that. Did you have any sense of, when you were in Thailand, of actually the scale of the kind of media attention and what was going on while you were actually involved in the rescue?
We would always ignore the media during any incident. And our job is very clear and very well defined. And it's not been unusual where the media are fed a line. For instance, the divers turn around with technical problems whilst relatives are notified that their beloved is deceased or whatever. So it would be incredibly inappropriate of us to talk to the media during any incident. So we just ignored it. We left that to the people who are good at doing that. We focused specifically on where our area of expertise were. And I don't think it was until I got back to Heathrow and a random woman came running up to me in the concourse and gave me chocolates and flowers that I probably realised that people have been watching. And I don't know where she'd come from, but she'd made the effort to get to the airport and felt that was important to her. It was slightly odd. But I guess, again, we're back to those visceral sort of feelings where you've got darkness, you've got danger, you've got water, and also a group of children trapped. People are emotional, and it kind of was what it was.
Yeah, I mean, the footage from when you discovered the boys, obviously, I mean, that literally, talk about going viral, I think that literally went everywhere around the world. It was quite an extraordinary thing. I remember watching it and thinking, wow, because like, I think you had obviously gone into that with the mindset that it was potentially going to be a recovery operation, not a rescue operation. And everyone else was being prepared for that as well. I think that was the way the media was framing it. It really did look very difficult, and notwithstanding, obviously, that there were lots and lots of people making a huge amount of effort to do it. But yeah, it was. I can imagine the level of attention would have been surprising when you did look at that.
That footage, we have a set of procedures that follows the chain of custody of evidence, and so we handed the footage directly to the Thai Navy SEALs, the diving supervisors, because they were technically in charge of diving. And before we'd managed to get out of the cave, they put it on Facebook. And we felt that was a really bad move, because it was effectively making a promise. And it was a promise. They didn't understand the problem. And we couldn't see at that time how any of the children were going to survive. And so putting that video out of a dozen live children seemed to be an incredibly bold thing to do when they didn't even really understand the problem. We wouldn't have done that.
Yeah, and actually that again makes enormous sense, because when you watch some of the stuff in the documentary, the kind of Thai officials' position as well was that we're not going to move them until there's zero risk. And of course, the reality is never going to be zero risk, right? It didn't matter what you were going to do; it was going to be risk, and the risk was probably going to be significant. So they did obviously have that kind of mindset, and were making almost promises to their own people in that sense that were going to be quite difficult to honour. And I mean, clearly, it would be wrong of us probably to talk about this. I mean, without acknowledging that, at least one, was it one Thai SEAL who died, or was there somebody else that died in it as well, which was tragic. I mean, it was obviously, which just highlights the risks that were involved in this. It was clearly a very dangerous situation.
It was, but it was unfortunately inevitable. I think the Thai Navy SEALs were incredibly brave, but they weren't cave divers, and so they were operating in an environment they didn't understand, with equipment that was unsuitable, with a mindset that was probably more appropriate to a battlefield. And as a civilian cave rescue expert, my personal safety is at the top of my priority list. That's rule 101. Don't add to the casualty list, as it were. And so it was almost inevitable that one of the SEALs was going to have an accident. And it didn't happen in vain, because that was the moment when the Thai Navy stepped back and said, we realise we can't do this. And we were able to step forwards. Had that not happened, I suspect they would have attempted to rescue a boy, and that would have had similar consequences.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's nothing happens by chance by and large in these things, does it? Almost the last question. What's the most memorable event of your life so far, if you haven't already given me it?
I don't really have a most memorable event. I'm not sort of prone towards pride. I think the one thing that I am struck by continuously is and this is quite unusual for me, but I'm struck by how my lad is growing up and the person he's becoming. Now, I'm not one of these people that looks at a 2-year-old's painting and says it's the Mona Lisa, they're gifted. I'm quite realistic about all sorts of youths and children, but I think memorable, pride, whatever. That's the one thing, and that's not necessarily a testament to me. That's a testament to him. He's old enough now to be making his own decisions and being his own person. But I think probably that as a memorable or sense of pride, that's probably where I'd have to go. But as I said, it's not really intended as a reflection on me. It's more of a reflection on him.
Yeah, I'm sure he would probably, if I was interviewing him, he would probably have a role model that might be his dad, because you have done some remarkable stuff, and your modesty is amazing, actually. But very last question then is one I always ask all my guests is, what's the most difficult question you've ever been asked?
Probably the most difficult question I've been asked is about the low point in life. That's it's very real to me. It's very personal, and I'm happy to be honest. But that's something it's very real. But I don't think blokes especially talk about that sort of stuff. I think it's a lot easier to say I'm fine or it's cool and then move on. But for me, that was a really key part of my life. And it's difficult to talk about, but it is very real. And so I see no reason not to try at least and talk about it.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And you raise a very interesting point about men not being good about talking about stuff. And I think that's such an important issue because, in a world where mental health is much more of a topic of conversation than it used to be, it's clearly so important that we do start to encourage people to talk more about these things and air some of the issues, because clearly male suicide is a massive problem, just extraordinary and tragic in all sorts of ways. So, and I think that's again, a powerful point. John, it has been an absolutely immense privilege to talk to you. I could talk to you for hours about some of this stuff. I think what you have done is remarkable. What you continue to do is remarkable. I know you probably would look at it rather differently than that, but trust me, it's an amazing privilege. Thank you very much. You great insights, really, really interesting. I'm very proud to have had the opportunity to have a chat to you.
No worries, I've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.